Stay at home. That is the message from Britain's most senior police officer to protesters planning another weekend of demonstrations in London.
The Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sadiq has put restrictions in place to try to prevent further violent clashes. Meanwhile, there are still fears that large gatherings could increase the spread of coronavirus.
The Mayor of London, Sadiq, joins us now. Very good morning to you. Thank you for your time. Can I just ask you, first of all, do you echo the sentiments and the words of Sadiq that people should stay away, to stay at home?
Yeah, it's really important people do. And my message to anybody thinking about coming to central London as part of the Black Lives Matter movement is please don't. And there's four main reasons why I'm asking you not to. Firstly, we're still in the middle of this global pandemic, and we now know two things. One, it's not possible with the large numbers who turn up to keep your social distance, even if you are wearing a face covering and washing your hands regularly with a sanitizer. But we also have confirmation from around the world, from the USA to Australia, that others who've been involved in protests have caught the virus. And what you wouldn't want to do is to catch the virus and then take it home with you and give it to an older person. But secondly, we know there are going to be some extreme far-right counter-protests taking place in London. And what we don't want to see in London is violence, vandalism or disorder. So please, my message is try and find another way to make sure your voice is heard, but that's not by coming to central London.
Is it difficult for you personally, given your role and what you said in the past, to advise people not to go out and protest on an issue that it is so important to so many people?
Well, one of the joys of living in a democracy, and I speak as somebody who's got family and friends who for many years haven't lived in a democracy in other parts of the world, is we get to protest when we're unhappy about things. And I stand in solidarity with the millions around the world as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. I speak as a former human rights lawyer who's brought cases arguing the importance of freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. But we're in the middle of a global pandemic, but also we have a situation today where we know extreme far-right groups are going to be turning up, sowing division and hatred, and central London, some of the statues could be flashpoints for violence. And actually, what we could have inadvertently is a diversion and a distraction from addressing issues around racism, inequality and discrimination, and instead talking about disorder, violence and vandalism. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the words from Sadiq. You're talking about concerns about far-right groups. I think specifically looking at her words, she said we do have information that people are intent on coming to cause violence and confrontation. I don't think she's actually said specifically which groups those are. Can I just ask you about some of the orders that we understand are in place? Namely that all assemblies must be finished by 1700 hours, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, why that time, and what will happen if after 5 o'clock people are still on the streets?
So the police have powers under the Public Order Act to lay down conditions on those who protest. They do it often to try and make sure protesters go down a certain route to avoid congestion and potential risks, but also to keep one group away from another group. So what the Met Police have done, and it's set out on their website and also on their Twitter account, is lay down conditions on the two main groups who will be protesting, the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the extreme far-right group as well. They're trying to keep them apart, but saying to both groups, well, firstly, don't come to London, but if you are going to come, these are the conditions. And one of the conditions is, as you've said, the protest must end by 5 p.m. And there's a number of reasons for that. Unfortunately, we've seen in the recent past that a small minority who get involved in vandalism and violence tend to do so later on in the course of the day. And secondly, it means that the police will be able to properly manage those who do decide to come, leaving central London.
So
many of those coming today aren't from
If
London.
you are one of the vast majority, and that has to be emphasised, that are coming to demonstrate peacefully, and you are, 25 past 5, 5:40, still there, it's still going on, what happens?
Well, it's the discretion of the police, but they do then have the power to arrest and detain. And so that's why it's really important. Firstly, avoid central London, don't come on the protests. But if you are going to come, be aware of the conditions that the police are able to lay down under the Public Order Act and make sure you abide by those conditions.
Because you'll be arrested. Is that ultimately what you're saying?
Yeah, the police can arrest, detain and charge ultimately if you breach the conditions.
Can I ask you, in connection with statues, which has become a sort of symbol for some of the protests, and we know that some have been defaced, some taken down, what happened in Bristol. I just wonder if I could ask you to reflect on some of Boris Johnson's comments. This was a number of tweets yesterday. In relation to statues, he was talking about the statues being put up in the first place. They had different perspectives, different understandings of right and wrong. But those statues, and he's talking about a number of statues, not specific ones, those statues teach us about our past with all its faults. To tear them down would be to lie about our history and impoverish the education of generations to come. Do you agree with him about that?
Yeah, I'm not suggesting at all. I don't think anybody sensible is to tear down any of the statues in Parliament Square. What we've done over the last 24 hours, 48 hours, is to make sure we protect our statues, the cenotaph and others. We've got intelligence, for example, that some of the extreme far right want to pull down the statue of Nelson Mandela. We know from last week some of our statues were vandalised and indeed a flag was set on fire on the cenotaph. What we're trying to do is to err on the side of caution and prevention, which is why we've boarded up these statues temporarily. And by the way, previous mayors, including Boris Johnson, have not simply fenced off Parliament Square for weeks and weeks and weeks, indeed for 6 months, but boarded up statues as well. And what I'd rather have is our statues are kept safe during the course of these protests when a small minority may be seeking to damage them. But also I'm well aware that the statue of Winston Churchill could be the focus point, the flashpoint for violence. And what I don't want is an excuse to protect the statues to be used by the far right, but also what I don't want is any flashpoints for violence.
And when the Prime Minister says that the statues in our cities and towns were put up by previous generations, but they teach us about our past, I mean, that would appear to be, and I'm not trying to read too much into this, when you hear that, I don't know what you hear, that seems to be, by implication, that they should stay.
Well, I think it's worth having a conversation and a discussion about our public realm, our public space. For example, do the squares, do the streets, do the statues in London properly reflect the contribution made by the diversity of our city? Women, for example, it wasn't until 2018 with the first statue of a woman in Parliament Square. Black, Asian, minority ethnic people, those who are disabled, those who are from the LGBTQ plus community. We should have that conversation to make sure our society properly reflects the contribution, but also I'm not somebody who thinks that we should be memorialising, commemorating, celebrating slavers, as we saw in Bristol, they do with the big presence of Colston in Bristol. And there are some statues in London of slavers, and I would welcome them being removed and replaced with statues of other people who've made a positive contribution towards our city and our country.
Do you think the Prime Minister's comments on this are helpful?
Well, what I would say in a polite, courteous way is I want to see this sort of passion from the Prime Minister in relation to addressing racism, inequality, discrimination. I want to see this sort of passion from the Prime Minister in relation to reducing the number of excess deaths from COVID-19. I want to see the passion from the Prime Minister and the animation from him when it comes to addressing the disproportionate number of Black, Asian, minority ethnics who have lost their lives from COVID-19. It's interesting. The one time we seem animated and passionate in the last few weeks is in relation to statues.
Are his comments helpful?
Well, I think I want to work closely with the government. What I don't want is an argument with the government in relation to such an important issue. I think the issue of racism, discrimination and equality should, bring people together. And that includes the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and myself. Party politics doesn't matter. If you're the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary or the Mayor, we should all agree that racism is bad. We should all recognise that Black people in our country and our city still face a huge amount of racism, and we should try and work together. And I really want to work with the government, with councils, with the media and others to address this issue. And the reality is, one of the reasons why George Floyd's brutal killing struck a chord, not just in Minnesota, Minneapolis and USA, but around the world, is a recognition that if you're a Black person, somebody of African Caribbean origin, the discrimination and racism that you endure is different to what I endure as somebody of Islamic faith and Asian origin and Pakistani heritage. And I think we should have real empathy with that and try and take meaningful steps to address the structural racism that still exists in 2020 in the USA, in the UK and around the world.
Sadiq Khan, thank you very much for your time this morning. Sadiq Khan speaking to us this morning, of course, the Mayor of London.
We will make America great again.